selfish and have a go at two very quick questions. The first is this: I'm a lawyer. If a second-year lawyer came into my office with an alliance agreement or a joint venture agreement that had a lot of rules governing the conduct of the parties, but didn't address the question of sanctions for breach, I'd be fairly agitated. So how did it happen? And the second question is the problem of chronic excessive chronic fiscal deficits just a European problem, or is it a problem with democracies around the world?
Okay, on the first question, how it happened, I mean, I was in Germany at the time when it happened, 2003, for the budget deficits under the old Schröder government, coinciding with budget deficits in France at the time. And the Germans put all their political capital they had against the European Commission. The European Commission wanted to punish Germany, of course, but the Germans prevented any kind of sanctions. So they only got kind of a reminder letter from Brussels that they should really get their house in order now, but no sanctions, nothing. And I think it set a precedent. It set a precedent for the rest of the Eurozone that it didn't have to take the Stability and Growth Pact too seriously. And if you just remember that one slide I had about the adherence to fiscal rules over the first 10 years of the Eurozone, I think there were, I forgot to count actually, but it must have been several dozen of breaches, because 17 countries, most of them almost routinely now violating the 60% debt rule, and about half the time violating the deficit rule. And you do the maths, so basically nobody played by the rules from the first day. And that also made it then difficult for, say, Germany and France to find harsher rules harsher packages for Greece, because the Greeks would then just turn back and say, well, actually, you didn't play by your own rules, you weren't punished then, why should we be punished now? In any case, I think the stability rules were not even sufficient at the time, because they were always talking just about some narrow fiscal criteria, when in fact they should have taken a much wider view on convergence, which would have included unit labor costs, for example, trade imbalances, the current account imbalances. So just to treat this whole Euro experiment as just one experiment in fiscal convergence, I think was always wrong anyway. So this whole framework never quite worked. And as I said before, many economists pointed out at the time that it was not just enough to have some fiscal rules. But I think they are just committing the same mistake once again by just focusing on this one issue too narrowly and completely losing sight of what's happening on the competitiveness front. And on your second question, which was again? Sorry.
This is a problem for this chronic fiscal imbalance, yes. A problem for democracies generally, not just in Europe.
Yes, unfortunately, yes. I think that's one of the reasons why the Americans are, of course, so concerned about what's happening in the euro crisis, because they fear that they're going to be next. And I just read that Tim Geithner is just on his way to Europe once again to tell them what to do. Well, yes, it is a problem for democracies. Fortunately, perhaps not as much for Australia. Although I would not quite claim that Australian political governments looks any more, what should I say, convincing or reassuring than what's happening in Europe, but we have more resources.
Oliver, do you think that there's a plan B or a series of plan Bs? My impression would be that the European elite in Brussels would not have a plan B, but the plan Bs might exist at the level of the individual countries. Like Germans may have a plan B, or I don't know, French, or some there might be some other plan Bs out there. How do you think, so that if that's true, then the actual breakup will be driven by the individual countries and not by the centre? How do you think about that?
I think that's absolutely correct. The breakup would not be originated in Brussels. It would be individual member states deciding that it's in their own best national interest to pull out, whether it is Greece or Germany in the end. Whether they actually have these plans at the national level, I don't know. I think the Germans entered monetary union quite naively and destroyed all the old Deutschmarks. Actually, at the time, I even had a piece of confetti of old Deutschmarks, which was quite interesting. So the Germans certainly didn't expect that. I heard a rumor, I'm not quite sure whether it's true, that when the euro was introduced, the French were actually taking their old banknotes and putting them in an old coal mine somewhere. So maybe that makes more sense. In any case, I think technically it is possible to introduce national currencies. There are already plans circulating in the German press now about some stamping of euro currency notes with magnetic ink to make them more or less safe. and prevent counterfeiting and introducing capital controls. And you read the German press and you get the impression that some people in the background are already having some clear ideas of how this could be done. But we are not there yet, sadly, because I think one of the solutions to the euro crisis, and perhaps the least painful one for the rest of the continent, would actually be Germany departing. Because let Germany leave, let Germany reintroduce its Deutschmark, or maybe introduce a new currency together with a hardcore bloc of countries like the Netherlands and Austria and Finland and Luxembourg, and leave the others with the euro carcass. At least they could still be dealing with debt denominated in their own currency. Maybe that would make it easier.
Justin.
Oliver, you mentioned that there's 4 crises. Is there a 5th crisis in terms of the tax base and the collection of tax revenue generally? And does that link into the sort of the wealth of the citizens?
No, if you like, there are more crises. There's a political crisis, there's a crisis of leadership, there's a crisis of labor market regulation, there's a crisis of tax collection. Yes, sure, I mean, all of that. But I was really just talking narrowly about what's happening, what crisis we see in relation to monetary union. But yes, you're right, sure, the other countries have enormous problems in some of these respects.
Well, sort of practical side, let's assume there was a demise of the euro. There would have to be possibly millions of commercial contracts out there running 10, 20 years in duration. How would that egg be unscrambled?
Difficult but not impossible. I mean, we had a number of currency unions that came to an end. We had, for example, the end of the currency union between the Czechs and the Slovaks, and that was done relatively easily. When it comes to contracts, when it comes to government debt, for example, 96% of Greek government debt is still denominated in, is of course all denominated in euro, but 96% is done under Greek law, which allows the Greek government to unilaterally declare that the currency of the debt changes overnight. So I think there are such solutions. I mean, it's probably the same kind of mechanism that was in place at the time of the introduction of the euro, where you will come up with an exchange rate, announce it overnight, and then basically just take that exchange rate and devalue everything accordingly, and then see what happens. I mean, there are a number of options that you have how to deal with the euro breakup. One of the interesting options is actually to have some kind of auction, introduce new national currencies, and then let the market decide how much these currencies are worth in an auctioning process. That's quite an interesting idea. But I mean, interesting competition is currently running, organized by my former employer in London, Policy Exchange, where you can win £250,000, at least, if you come up with the most practical solution how to break up the Eurozone. It's a nice idea. It's open to economists around the world, so if you want to submit your 15,000 words till the 31st of January, give it a go.
Happy to have anyone now such a competition here, by the way. Gilles.
I guess my question is related. If the countries all break up in this, what then? I mean, what really solves the problem? It seems to me as if every country then has a problem, and we'll wait the rest of our lives to see that wash out. There's no quick fix.
No, there's no quick fix, certainly, but I think you can't let the situation fester on for much longer.
I agree with that.
There is a saying in German that translates into something like, it's better to have an end with terror than terror without end. And I think we've had enough terror already, so we should really bring this to an end and let the market sort it out. And one thing that would have to happen in any case is a readjustment of exchange rates in the periphery. And you can't get this under the monetary corset of the euro. So I think it's unavoidable. They will have to depart sooner or later. And it will probably be the best for these countries to regain competitiveness. I envisage cheap holidays for German tourists in Greece, for example, which they would never get. They would never get these tourists if they stay in the euro, because they're simply not able to compete for tourist euros or tourist dollars if they're surrounded by non-euro countries like Croatia and Turkey. So I think that's the only chance that these countries really have to regain competitiveness, introducing their own currencies and then devalue them, and probably also default on some of their debt. Because that's the typical solution that you always take when a country is heavily indebted. That's the typical IMF solution to these debt crises. You let these countries default, you let them devalue, and you can't do this in the Eurozone, so I think that's where we have to go.
Oliver, given the dire outlook for the euro, or the Eurozone, is there any explanation why the euro hasn't devalued substantially yet?
Well, because actually it has devalued. quite massively against the Australian dollar.
Obviously, I don't know, but
yeah.
I think the US dollar. So.
Yeah, but that's a sick currency too.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's the one-eyed who's king among the blinds. We've got two sick currencies battling it out. So one looks stronger one day, the other one looks stronger the next. But really, if you compare it to non-euro currencies, you compare to what, for example, happened in relationship with the Swiss franc. You compare the euro exchange rate to the Australian dollar. There you can see that markets are already forming their judgment on the euro and the stability, and it doesn't look that good. I mean, the Europeans are kind of fooling themselves into believing that they're still strong because they're still so strong against the US dollar. I mean, they should take a different yardstick.
Yeah, right.
Oliver, what probability do you attach to a recession in Europe sort of developing in the next 12 months? And
100%.
100%.
It's underway. It's happening. There are forecasts now coming out of Goldman Sachs that the Eurozone is experiencing 0.8% recession next year. It's happening. They are there. I mean, the periphery is already there. Germany is slowing down. There's no chance they can escape recession.
So I was just going to add to that. In terms, relating onto that then, to what extent do you then theorise this could all be, could turn ugly very quickly? And what I mean by that is a real freezing up of credit markets, interbank lending sort of freezing up in a way that we saw in 2008. Could this actually be a lot worse than we saw there? Really freeze up international credit markets.
Again, I think it is already happening. It's
commenced, but,
it's already started, and if it gets to that 2008 point, I think it will be far more severe because we're talking about more money. It's not just Lehman Brothers.
Yeah.
We're talking about countries with a total debt balance sheet of 2 trillion euros, like Italy. How can you organize an Italian default, even if it's just 20% or 30% haircut? We're talking about enormous sums of money.
How do you see the impact on Britain?
I mean, Britain, in a way, has been shielded from a lot of these problems, of course, because they still have their own currency. They have devalued against the euro, so that's probably helped them. But they are not immune. Europe is their biggest trading partner, by far their biggest trading partner. I think what is shielding Britain from a speculation, because they're in a terrible budget position themselves. Britain is running a 10% budget deficit. Britain is getting close to 100% debt to GDP, and that's just the official figure. So Britain doesn't look any more stable than France or Italy. It's heavily indebted too. What's shielding them, what's protecting them, it's so much more difficult to actually liquidate your positions in Britain because you have to basically convert it, you have to get out of sterling if you really think that Britain is under pressure. Whereas it's much more easy to speculate against Spain or Italy because you take your money out, you have euros, you go straight into Germany or France if you like, or Luxembourg or whatever. So that in that way it is more difficult to speculate against the British government. It is also more difficult to speculate against them because they still have the Bank of England engaged in quantitative easing. So far £275 billion, probably rising next year again. We already see signals coming out of the Bank of England. So it doesn't look good for Britain, but at least they have some flexibility on the monetary fund, although they are in recession. And I mean, you saw the figures coming out of the Office for Budget Responsibility last week. It certainly doesn't look good for Britain. And that's before they have even started really implementing austerity measures.
Now, Europe and China, if I understand, are each other's biggest trading bloc. Is that right? Something.
True.
So a Europe-wide recession knocking onto China, and then obviously that will have an impact here. What do you think of that?
Well, that's the most likely transmission mechanism of the European crisis, so that it can reach Australia if it slows down China substantially, and then the Chinese start importing Australian commodities. Quite likely. And by the way, I don't think that China is going to save Europe, because the Chinese, probably not even the Chinese, have enough money to stop it. And they have no interest really in stopping it, because the Chinese, as we all know, hold a lot of their reserves in US dollars and have quite an interest in keeping the US dollar more or less stable. What would happen if the Chinese pulled out of their US dollar reserves to invest it in Europe, in euros to stabilize Europe? I think that it wouldn't be in China's best interest to do that. So don't bank on the Chinese. They have already signaled over the last 2 weeks to Klaus Regling, the head of the EFSF, that they have no interest in becoming engaged in Europe to the degree that's necessary to stop the euro crisis. So don't bank on China.
Will, I think you have a question.
Yeah, later this week there seems to be some big expectation that they're going to come out with some more hard and fast ideas of what to do. Have you got a view on what they might come out with?
Well, it's if I count correctly, it's the 14th summit with great expectations over the last 18 months, and it's the 4th or 5th summit this year where they say this is make or break. So yes, I mean, markets always have great expectations. Markets are usually very hopeful. I predict that on Monday morning markets will rally again because European leaders appear at a press conference at 4 a.m. and smile, and that's a good sign. And then on Tuesday or Wednesday they will look at the fine print of what's been decided and decide that this was all a big scam once again, and so they will probably all collapse again and wait for the next big summit in January. It's a good tool actually if you want to have a strategy for your investment decisions, just to go on the EU Commission's website, because they've got a list of their upcoming summits, and then just time your transactions accordingly. I would really take some positions for the Mondays after summits. You probably have to wait sometime until it's decided, usually around 4:30 European time, so just before the markets open in Asia. I think it's a good indication.
Oliver, as someone with an Italian background, I mean, you open with a joke, which is always a good way to start a speech. There are two aspects of your joke which I think are interesting. Firstly, I'd like to take exception to the prediction contained in that joke. There is no way the Italians could ever be properly organised.
Okay.
Firstly. But secondly, the other serious part of that joke was that Germany might take control. And that's, I suppose, comes back to the whole issue of the European project, which was about somewhat contained Germany. If the euro were to break apart, where does it put Germany in terms of that project?
Okay, the joke. Well, I think it wasn't quite the expectation that Germany would rule over Italy, but that the Italians would become more German in the process, and that they would become more competitive and more productive and more efficient. And that is certainly the hope, and it's still the hope in a way, with all of these fiscal stability measures that are currently being announced, that you can turn Italians, Greeks, Spaniards and Portuguese into some kind of German stability, German focus on monetary stability, German focus on efficiency, productivity and so on, and it's not going to happen. I think that's one of the reasons why this current proposal that we heard last night from Merkel and Sarkozy will fail, because you can't turn Italians and Spanish and Greeks into Germans, because they have different economic cultures, they have a different relationship to money, they don't really think it is such a tragedy to let inflation run at 4 or 5%, whereas the Germans would never take that. So I think it was always a mistake to believe that you can run the whole continent according to German laws and German ideas. It's not going to work. Apart from that, and that's the second part of your question, I think the Germans have not the least interest in running Europe. You know, I'm always puzzled because most commentators still assume, especially in Britain, that Germany really wants to just erect its Fourth Reich and command the rest of Europe around, and okay, they don't want to invade them anymore, but at least they want to tell them what to do. The Germans have no such interests. The Germans actually want to be a larger version of Switzerland, you know, very respectable, rich, but a bit boring and vigorously unengaged in international affairs, because that's what they learned to play to perfection in the time after the Second World War, for good reasons, of course. They had their share of international power for some time, and they saw where that led, so that was a bad thing, and the Germans didn't want to have anything to do with it anymore. Apart from that, they couldn't, because they were not even sovereign until 1990. So for Germany to actually rediscover that there is a world outside Germany in which Germany should take a leading role or should be engaged with, that took some time to realize. And the Germans are not even there yet. They don't want to run the show. They have no interest in paying for others. They want to do their own thing, and they're completely irritated now that the rest of Europe believes that they have any imperial wishes or desires. They have no such thing. It's quite interesting now that last week there was the Polish Foreign Secretary speaking in Berlin at a meeting, and he said, it may sound very strange to you, but I may be the first Polish Foreign Secretary in history who is not afraid of German action, but of German inaction. The Germans don't want to do anything.
If it does break apart one way or the other, what happens to the German economy? Because presumably the currency goes through the roof and takes away that whole, and so that the only engine in Europe seemingly gets done by the currency.
It will be extremely tough for Germany once it falls apart, whether it is a Greek, Spanish, Portuguese departure, or whether it's Germany pulling out outright. No doubt about it. However, I think that the negative effects are overstated because, well, first reason, Germany has already become what Hans-Werner Sinn, president of the IFO Institute, calls a bazaar economy. So a lot of Germany's exports are only finalized in Germany. They're produced elsewhere, shipped to Germany, the Germans do the final touches, and then export them again. But that, of course, means if Germany leaves the Eurozone and gets a currency realignment, and the German mark, or whatever you call it, appreciates, all these import goods will also become cheaper. So the actual effect on German export may not be as severe as we now fear. So that's the first effect. The second effect, you remember that slide with the current account imbalances. It's not very healthy to run Europe like this, where the Germans always export more than they import and the others always import more than they export. So you need to realign this. The Germans need to consume more and they need to export less, or maybe they need to do both at the same time. I think it would actually be desirable to slow Germany down in that sense, give German workers perhaps an increase in their real wages, which they will feel because the currency appreciates. Germans can suddenly afford a bit more, consume a bit more. And that would be quite desirable, actually, even if it slows down Germany over time, because they need to get rid of this trade surplus because it's killing the rest of Europe.
Is there a parallel in China?
Well, Germany is very much like China. They're running effectively a mercantilist policy. They are trying to export and export and export, and they export themselves crazy and believe that they are extremely self-righteous, of course, because they think everybody else should be like them. But they don't realize that, of course, not everybody in this world can run a trade surplus. That's logically impossible, and the Germans are trying that, of course. They tell the rest of Europe, you have to be like us. Well, if everybody in Europe was like the Germans, they would all export and export and export, and nobody would import. That's logically impossible. The Germans actually have to realize that they are at the moment benefiting from this whole collapse. In a number of ways, they can export like crazy, they have their unemployment under control. Unemployment is actually at the lowest level in Germany for 25 years. They get extremely low interest rates. The German treasurer in this last short-term debt auction had to pay negative interest on Germany's debt. So although Germany's debt is now at 82% of GDP, they pay less in interest in the federal budget than they ever paid in the last 20 years, because they hardly have to pay anything anymore. By the way, that failed German bond auction, remember 2-3 weeks ago, when it didn't quite clear, that was not a sign of German weakness. That was just a sign that the Germans were becoming too cheeky, because they tried to get their 10-year debt for 2%, and markets said, well, okay, now you're stretching it a bit too far. No, the Germans at the moment benefit. They even get interest payments from the Greeks. You know, the German Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, that KfW bank, has given Greece a 15 billion loan, and the Greeks are paying interest. So Germany is actually making a killing out of the euro crisis at the moment. And then they're having the nerve to tell the rest of of Europe that they should play by German rules because the Germans are so good. They have to really question themselves, and they have to come up with a solution that actually works for the rest of the continent as well, not just for them.
Michael, now we need a
I'm sure we could go on for a lot longer and be horrified and made extremely nervous, but Oliver, thank you for your remarks. It's definitely a case of cometh the moment, cometh the man. I mean, Oliver was hired to come here to bring expertise as an economist, and he had particular expertise in populations and urban policy and all that sort of thing, and events have swept him away in a different direction, but we're delighted. It's interesting to think about and understand at the level that Oliver is able to give us what's going on in Europe and in a way think the unthinkable, because there's a lot of people out there in full denial. And there was one commentator who made the wonderful remark that isn't it extraordinary how these days things go from unthinkable to inevitable without going through a middle stage. We need to understand that. The second thing is, I think, which we didn't dwell on a lot today, but Oliver mentioned the idea of transmission mechanisms. Australia, of course, will not be immune from that process. And it's unpredictable, and how the transmission mechanisms will work, it doesn't really matter, but they will. There will be some effect. And it just behoves us, I think, to think a little bit more carefully about not doing silly things as a country and preparing ourselves a little bit better to take advantage of what is essentially a very fortunate position. So Oliver, thank you. Thank you, Greg, for putting this on. I've no doubt that this issue won't go away, so we may have a reprise event. I know we've been discussing at the board level the program for Concilium next year, and there's going to be something on that. We've decided that it won't go away before then. And thank you all for coming along.